Won the night she realized something was missing. He was right beside her, and somehow, he had never felt farther away. That was the night Claire finally understood that loneliness did not always arrive when you were alone. Sometimes, it sat across from you at the dinner table. Sometimes, it answered your questions with a soft smile and tired eyes. Sometimes, it reached for your hand, but never quite held on. Daniel had always been that kind of man. Present in all the ways that could be seen. Gone in all the ways that mattered. The apartment was quiet that evening, wrapped in the soft yellow light of two half-burned lamps. Outside, rain tapped gently against the window, as if the night itself was trying not to interrupt what was slowly breaking inside her. Claire stood in the kitchen for a moment longer than necessary, watching Daniel from across the room. He was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone, expression unreadable, distant in a way that had become so familiar it almost felt normal. Almost. She carried 2 mugs of tea to the coffee table and sat beside him. Close enough to touch him. Close enough to smell the faint cedar on his shirt. Close enough to pretend they were still connected. "Long day?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, just tired." That was all. No story, no detail, no opening. Just another small wall built out of ordinary words. Claire looked down at her tea, watching the steam disappear into the air. She had learned to survive on fragments. A tired smile, a hand on her shoulder, a good-night kiss that felt more like habit than longing. She kept telling herself that love did not always need language, that some people cared quietly, that maybe Daniel's silence was simply another form of devotion. But deep down, something in her had started trembling. Because love, real love, could be quiet, but it could not be absent. She turned to him again, hoping for something she could not even name anymore. A glance, a question, a sign that he noticed the heaviness in her chest, that he could feel her slowly slipping behind a polite smile. But Daniel never looked up. And in that tiny, ordinary moment, something sharp and devastating passed through her. Not anger, not even heartbreak, just truth. The kind that arrives without warning and changes the shape of everything. It wasn't that he was cruel. It wasn't that he didn't care at all. It was something harder to explain, and somehow harder to survive. He was there, but he was unreachable. Claire sat frozen, staring at the man she loved, and for the first time, allowed herself to name the emptiness she had been carrying for months. She was not asking for too much. She was asking the wrong person. And that was the night she realized the most painful kind of distance is the one that lives in the same room with you. Before we go deeper, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast, where quiet pain, hidden truths, and the stories people never say out loud finally find a voice. To love that felt almost real. There were moments when Claire almost convinced herself that everything was fine. Not perfect. Not passionate. But fine. Daniel had a way of making things feel calm again just when doubt began to grow too loud. He would appear beside her at the exact moment she had started wondering if she mattered less than she thought. One evening, he showed up outside her office building without warning. The sky had already turned dark blue, and the city lights were beginning to flicker on one by one. Claire stepped out of the glass doors expecting another quiet walk home alone. Instead, Daniel was leaning against the railing, hands in his coat pockets. "I thought you might still be working," he said with a small smile. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No grand apology, no confession, just his presence. And somehow, that was enough to soften everything she had been carrying all day. They walked through the city slowly, shoulder to shoulder, the cold air brushing against their faces. Daniel told her about a strange meeting at work. Claire laughed at something he said. The sound surprised even her, because for a few minutes, the heaviness inside her chest seemed to lift. That was Daniel's quiet magic. He never fixed the distance between them. But sometimes, he made it easy to forget it was there. Later that night, they stopped at a small cafe that stayed open late. Warm light spilled onto the sidewalk as they stepped inside. Claire wrapped her hands around a cup of coffee while Daniel watched her across the table. "You look tired," he said gently. I am, she admitted. Daniel reached forward and brushed a strand of hair away from her face. The gesture was soft, almost tender. Claire felt a quiet warmth move through her chest. In moments like that, everything felt real. His eyes were calm. His voice was gentle. His presence felt steady. And Claire wanted to believe that this quiet version of love, was simply who Daniel was. Maybe he wasn't expressive. Maybe he didn't speak about emotions the way other men did. But maybe love didn't always need to be loud. Maybe it could exist in small gestures. In shared silence. In a hand resting briefly over hers. For a while, Claire allowed herself to live inside that possibility. She told herself that relationships had seasons. That people moved at different emotional speeds. That patience was sometimes the truest form of love. And Daniel never said anything that directly contradicted that hope. He never told her he didn't care. He never told her to leave. Instead, he gave her just enough warmth to keep the story alive. A smile when she least expected it. A late-night message asking if she got home safely. A quiet arm around her shoulders during a crowded subway ride. Fragments of closeness. Pieces of something that almost looked like love. And that was what made it so difficult to see the truth. Because absence is easy to recognize. But something that feels almost real can keep a heart waiting far longer than it should. Free the pattern she couldn't ignore. At first, Claire told herself it was just stress. Daniel worked long hours. His phone rang constantly. His mind seemed to live somewhere else even when his body was right in front of her. She tried to understand that kind of life. She tried to be patient with it. But slowly, quietly, something began forming in the back of her mind. A pattern. It didn't appear all at once. Patterns never do. They reveal themselves through repetition, small moments that feel unrelated at first. Until one day you realize they have all been telling the same story. Claire began to notice when Daniel disappeared emotionally. It always happened at the same time. Whenever a conversation started to move closer to something real. One night, they were sitting on the floor of her living room, sharing a late dinner from takeout containers. Music was playing softly from a small speaker near the window. For a moment, everything felt easy between them. Claire leaned back against the couch and asked a simple question. Where do you see yourself in a few years? Daniel froze for just half a second. Not long enough for someone distracted to notice. But long enough for someone who was paying attention. He took a slow sip of water before answering. I don't really think that far ahead, he said. Then he changed the subject. Just like that. Another night, Claire tried again. This time the question was softer, almost careful. Do you ever think about what kind of life you want, eventually? Daniel smiled, but it was the kind of smile that closed doors instead of opening them. I try not to overthink life, he said lightly. And again, the conversation drifted away. At first, Claire let those moments pass. People had different emotional languages. She told herself, some men weren't comfortable talking about the future. Some people needed time before opening up. But time was passing. Weeks turned into months. And the same invisible wall appeared again and again. Every time the conversation approached love, commitment, or the future, Daniel stepped back. Sometimes he laughed it off. Sometimes he turned the question into a joke. Sometimes he simply went quiet. And Claire began to realize something unsettling. Daniel wasn't confused. He wasn't unsure. He was avoiding. Avoiding the kind of emotional depth that would require him to stay fully present. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't anger. It was distance. The kind that hides behind kindness. One evening, Claire was telling him about something deeply personal, something from her childhood she rarely shared with anyone. She spoke slowly, carefully choosing her words. Daniel listened. He nodded. But halfway through her story, his phone lit up on the table. He glanced at it. And in that tiny, almost invisible movement, Claire felt the shift again. His attention drifted away. Not dramatically. Not rudely. Just enough to remind her that she was standing at the edge of something he would never fully step into. And suddenly, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Daniel was present for the light moments. The laughter. The easy conversations. The quiet dinners. But the moment emotions grew deeper, he was already gone. For the sentence that didn't sound like love. Claire had replayed that evening in her mind more times than she wanted to admit. Not because it was dramatic. Not because there had been shouting, or tears, or a slammed door. But because of how ordinary it sounded when something inside her quietly cracked. They were in Daniel's apartment that night. The room was dim except for the low amber light from a lamp near the bookshelf. A muted basketball game flickered across the television, though neither of them was really watching it. Claire sat curled into the far end of the couch, one leg folded beneath her, her fingers wrapped around a mug that had already gone cold. Daniel was beside her, close enough to touch, far enough to feel impossible. For most of the evening, they had spoken in fragments. Small things, safe things, work, traffic, a friend Daniel had run into earlier that week. The kind of conversation that could make two people look connected from the outside. Even when something essential had already gone missing underneath. Claire had spent the last few weeks trying not to push too hard. Trying not to ask for too much. Trying not to be the woman who turned every quiet moment into an emotional interrogation. But restraint has a limit when your heart is starving. She turned toward him slowly. Her voice, when it came out, was soft, careful, almost apologetic. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel glanced at her, then nodded. "Sure." Claire hesitated for just a second. "Do you ever feel like, when things get emotional between us, you kind of disappear?" The question landed gently. She had tried to make it gentle. No blame, no accusation, just truth, offered with trembling hands. Daniel leaned back against the couch and let out a breath through his nose. Not angry, not defensive, just tired. For a moment, he said nothing. Claire watched his face, searching for some sign that he understood what this had cost her to say. Then he rubbed the back of his neck and looked away. "I'm not good at this," he said, "the emotional stuff." That was the sentence. Simple, calm, almost harmless. And yet something in Claire went still. Because it didn't sound like love. It sounded like distance translated into polite language. She kept looking at him, waiting for more, waiting for him to reach for her hand, waiting for him to say, "But I want to try," waiting for some small sign that his confession was an opening, not an exit. But nothing came. Just silence. The kind that forces meaning into every empty space. Daniel wasn't cruel when he said it. That was part of what made it hurt so much. His tone was measured, honest, maybe, even a little vulnerable. But honesty, Claire realized in that moment, was not always comfort. Sometimes honesty was simply the cleanest shape of heartbreak. Because what he had really said was this. "When you need something deeper from me, I won't know how to meet you there." Claire looked down at her hands, at the fading warmth of the mug between them, and felt a sharp ache move through her chest. She had spent so long translating Daniel's silence into something tender, something wounded, something temporary. Now she was hearing it in plain English. Not a promise. Not a choice. Not love reaching back. Just limitation. And the worst part was that he said it as if it explained everything. As if naming the wounds somehow excused the bleeding. Claire nodded once, though she barely felt herself do it. She didn't argue, she didn't cry, she just sat there, staring into the quiet, realizing that sometimes the most painful sentence in a relationship isn't an insult. It's a confession that sounds reasonable. Right before it teaches you how alone you've been. 5. When silence becomes a language. After that conversation, nothing exploded. There was no argument. No dramatic goodbye. No moment that clearly marked the beginning of the end. Instead, something quieter happened. The space between them grew, and it grew silently. At first, Claire told herself that things simply needed time. People didn't change overnight. Emotional habits, especially the ones built over years, didn't disappear because of one honest conversation. So she waited. And Daniel stayed. At least physically. He still came over some evenings. He still texted occasionally during the day. Sometimes he would ask if she had eaten dinner. Sometimes he would send a short message late at night that said, "Get some rest." On the surface, everything looked normal enough. But Claire began to notice something she couldn't ignore. Daniel had become quieter. Not in the peaceful way two people can share silence comfortably, but in the way someone goes quiet when they are slowly stepping away. The messages became shorter. Where he once wrote, "How's your day going?" Now it was simply, "You good?" Where he once stayed on the phone for 20 minutes, listening to her talk about work or a difficult coworker. Now the calls ended after 3. "Long day," he would say. "Talk tomorrow." Claire began to feel something strange about their silence. It wasn't empty anymore. It was speaking. At dinner one night, they sat across from each other in a small restaurant Daniel liked. The lights were warm, the music soft, the kind of place couples usually leaned closer in. But Claire noticed something different. Daniel's eyes kept drifting toward the window, or toward the table behind her, or down to his phone. Not constantly. Just enough. Just enough to remind her that his attention was somewhere else. She asked him about his day. He answered. She told him a story about something that had happened at work. He nodded. But the conversation never deepened. Every sentence felt like it stopped just before something meaningful could begin. Claire started recognizing the rhythm. Silence had become Daniel's way of managing distance. Instead of saying, "I don't want to talk about this," he simply gave less. Less detail. Less curiosity. Less presence. And because he wasn't cruel about it, because he never raised his voice or pushed her away directly, it took Claire longer than she expected to understand what was happening. Daniel wasn't fighting the relationship. He was slowly stepping out of it. One quiet moment at a time. One unfinished conversation after another. Until Claire realized something painful about silence. Sometimes it isn't the absence of words. Sometimes it's the clearest message someone can send. 6. The invisible wall. Claire didn't notice the wall the first time it appeared. Not because it wasn't there, but because invisible things rarely announce themselves. At the beginning, Daniel still sat close to her. He still laughed at the right moments. His hand still rested on her back when they crossed the street together. From the outside, nothing looked broken. But slowly, Claire began to feel something strange in the space between them. It was subtle. Like speaking into a room where the sound didn't quite return the way it used to. One evening, they were sitting on Claire's balcony. The city below them hummed quietly with distant traffic and the glow of late-night lights. A soft breeze moved through the air, carrying the faint smell of rain. Claire had been quiet for most of the evening, watching Daniel scroll through something on his phone. Not obsessively, just casually enough to make the silence feel heavier. Finally, she spoke. "Can I tell you something honestly?" Daniel looked up and nodded. "Of course." Claire hesitated for a moment. Her voice, when it came out, was gentle. "Sometimes it feels like there's a wall between us." Daniel frowned slightly, not in anger, but in confusion. "What do you mean?" Claire searched for the right words. "It's not that you're mean. You're not distant in an obvious way. You're here, you talk, you listen." She paused. "But sometimes when I try to get closer to how you really feel, it's like I can't reach you." The words hung in the air between them. Daniel leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment. "I don't know," he said slowly. "Maybe you're overthinking it." It wasn't said harshly. It was calm, casual, almost reassuring. But Claire felt the wall grow taller in that moment. Because overthinking had become the easiest way to dismiss the things she felt most deeply. She didn't argue, she simply nodded, though something inside her tightened. They sat there for a while longer. The city lights flickered, cars passed far below. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed briefly and disappeared again into the night. Daniel began talking about something unrelated, a new project at work. A coworker who had made a mistake during a meeting. Claire listened. She smiled when she was supposed to, But something had shifted. The wall was clearer now. Not made of anger. Not built from betrayal. Just layers of emotional distance that Daniel didn't seem able, or willing, to cross. Claire realized something painful in that quiet moment. Walls like that don't always appear because someone pushes you away. Sometimes they exist because someone never learned how to let you in. 7. The moment she needed him most. There are certain days in life when the world feels heavier than usual. Not because of one dramatic event, but because everything small begins to pile up at once. Stress from work, a difficult conversation with a friend, a memory that arrives unexpectedly and refuses to leave. That day was like that for Claire. The morning had already started wrong. A presentation she had prepared for weeks collapsed under a series of unexpected questions from her manager. By afternoon, the tension in her chest felt tight enough to make every breath shallow. Normally, Claire would have handled it quietly. She had always been the kind of person who carried her struggles alone. But something about that day felt different. For the first time in a long while, she didn't want to be strong. She wanted comfort. And without thinking too much about it, she reached for her phone and called Daniel. The call rang longer than usual. Claire watched the small circle on the screen spin again and again while the sound echoed softly through the speaker. Finally, the call went to voicemail. She hesitated for a moment before leaving a message. "Hey, it's me. I had kind of a rough day. If you're free later, maybe we could talk." Her voice sounded calmer than she actually felt. That evening, she waited. At first, she told herself he was probably busy. Daniel's work schedule was unpredictable. Meetings ran late, calls stretched into the evening. An hour passed. Then another. Claire tried to distract herself. She cooked a simple dinner she barely touched. She turned on the television but couldn't focus on what was playing. Her phone stayed silent on the table beside her. Eventually, around 10 at night, the screen lit up. A message from Daniel. She opened it quickly. "Sorry, long day, just saw your call." Claire stared at the message for a moment, waiting for the second line. Maybe he would ask what happened. Maybe he would call. But nothing followed. Just those 6 words sitting quietly on the screen. And suddenly Claire understood something she had been trying not to see. Daniel was not the person she could lean on when things fell apart. Not because he didn't care at all, but because being present for someone else's pain required a kind of emotional closeness he had never learned how to give. Claire placed the phone back on the table and sat in the quiet of her apartment. Outside, cars moved slowly through the wet streets, their headlights reflecting against the dark pavement. Inside, the room felt still. Not empty. Just unsupported. And in that quiet moment, Claire realized something painful. The person you love can be standing in your life, and still not be the one who catches you when you fall. 8. The night he disappeared. At first, Claire didn't think much about it. Daniel had always been a little unpredictable with his time. Some nights he stayed late at work. Other nights he disappeared into long meetings, networking dinners, or phone calls that stretched far beyond midnight. So when Friday evening arrived and she hadn't heard from him, she told herself it was nothing unusual. Still, something felt slightly different. Earlier that day, they had exchanged a few casual messages. Nothing emotional, just the small kind of conversation people have when life is moving too quickly. "Busy day?" she had asked. "Yeah, crazy schedule," he replied. That was the last thing she heard from him. By 7 o'clock, Claire found herself checking her phone more often than she wanted to admit. The apartment was quiet around her, the soft glow of the lamp reflecting off the window beside the couch. Outside, the city moved normally. Cars passed. People walked along the sidewalk below. Somewhere in the distance, music drifted faintly from a restaurant down the street. Life was continuing. But Daniel had vanished from it. At 8, she sent a message. "Hey, everything okay?" The message delivered instantly. No reply. Claire tried to focus on something else. She cleaned the kitchen. She folded laundry that had been sitting in a basket for days. She turned on the television and let the sound fill the room, though she barely noticed what was playing. 9 o'clock came. Still nothing. The silence began to feel heavier now, pressing gently against the edges of her thoughts. By 10, she told herself she was overreacting. People had lives, phones died, plans changed. But even as she tried to be reasonable, a quiet unease settled into her chest. Because Daniel had always been distant emotionally, but disappearing entirely was new. She opened their message thread again and stared at the last line he had sent that afternoon. Crazy schedule. Claire typed a second message, then hesitated before sending it. Just checking in. Again, the message delivered. Again, no response. The night stretched slowly around her. The city lights dimmed one by one as people returned home and the sidewalks grew quieter. Claire sat on the couch, her phone resting beside her like an unanswered question. Midnight passed. Then 1 in the morning. By then, Claire wasn't angry. She wasn't even anxious anymore. She was simply aware of something that felt cold and undeniable. Daniel hadn't just been busy. He had chosen not to be there. And that realization settled quietly into her mind, the way certain truths do when they no longer ask permission to exist. Because sometimes disappearance isn't about distance. Sometimes it's about avoidance. And that night, sitting alone in the soft blue glow of her living room, Claire understood something she had been resisting for months. Daniel didn't leave suddenly. He had been leaving slowly all along. 9 The conversation that broke everything. By the time Daniel finally sat across from her, Claire was no longer confused. She was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix. The deeper kind. The kind that comes from carrying uncertainty for too long and calling it hope. They met at Claire's apartment on a Sunday evening. The rain had passed earlier, but the windows still held faint streaks of water, and the air inside felt strangely still. A single lamp in the corner gave the room a soft amber glow. It should have felt warm. Instead, it felt like the kind of light people sit in when they are about to say something they can never take back. Daniel stood near the kitchen for a moment before sitting down, as if even choosing a place in the room required more energy than usual. Claire watched him quietly. His face looked composed, but not calm. There was something closed behind his eyes, something already halfway gone. She had spent days rehearsing what to say. Shorter versions, kinder versions, stronger versions, but now that he was here, all of those carefully prepared words felt thin compared to the ache in her chest. So she chose the truth. Not polished. Not strategic. Just true. Daniel, she said softly, I need you to be honest with me. He looked at her, then nodded once. Claire held his gaze longer than she normally would. Do you love me? The question entered the room and changed everything. Daniel didn't answer. At first, it was just a pause. A normal one, the kind people take when they're surprised. But then the silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. Long enough for Claire to hear the refrigerator humming in the next room. Long enough for her heartbeat to start pounding in her ears. He looked down at his hands. Then toward the window. Anywhere but at her. And in that silence, Claire felt something inside her begin to collapse. Because sometimes the answer comes before the words do. Sometimes hesitation is the answer. Sometimes the delay tells the truth that the mouth is too afraid to say. Finally Daniel exhaled, slow and controlled, like a man trying to speak without opening a wound he had spent years protecting. I care about you, he said. Claire didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't rescue him from what he had just done. Because she heard it immediately, the distance hidden inside the sentence. The careful substitution, the way he reached for a gentler phrase instead of the one she had asked for. Not yes. Not I do. Not even I'm trying to. Just, I care about you. For a moment, the room felt unreal. Claire stared at him as if she were watching someone quietly erase a future with the softest voice possible. She had imagined heartbreak as something louder. A slammed door, a cruel sentence, a betrayal too obvious to deny. But this was worse. This was heartbreak in a whisper. What does that mean? She asked, though her voice had already started to thin around the edges. Daniel rubbed his palms together and looked down again. It means, you matter to me. A lot. Again, not love. Again, not enough. Claire felt tears rise, not sudden, not dramatic, but slow and hot, like grief finally reaching the surface after months of being held under. She wasn't crying only because of his words. She was crying because of all the moments that suddenly made sense. Every unfinished conversation, every emotional retreat, every time she needed closeness and got politeness instead. She had not been imagining it. She had been surviving it. So that's it? She asked. That's what this has been? Daniel said nothing. And somehow, his silence was crueler now than honesty would have been. Because silence, at least then, no longer felt confused. It felt like permission to stop pretending. Claire looked at the man she had loved, and for the first time, she stopped searching his face for comfort. She stopped hoping the next sentence would save them. She stopped translating his distance into something tender. The conversation didn't explode. It ended the way fragile things often end, quietly, while one person finally admits that what they were holding was never truly theirs. And in that room, with rain still drying on the windows and the lamp casting tired light across the floor, Claire understood the thing that broke everything wasn't just what Daniel said. It was what he could not say, even when losing her should have made it easy. The truth he never said before. For a long moment after Claire's question, Daniel said nothing. Not because he hadn't heard her, not because he didn't understand what was happening, but because sometimes the truth sits in a person's throat for years before it finally finds a way out. The room had gone so quiet that every small sound seemed sharpened. The hum of the lamp, the distant rush of tires outside on wet pavement, Claire's own breathing, slow and uneven, as if her body already knew it was about to hear something it had been waiting for, and fearing, for a very long time. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped so tightly that the color had drained from his knuckles. He looked down at the floor instead of at her. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual. I didn't grow up around people who talked about feelings. Claire didn't interrupt. Daniel swallowed once, then kept going, as if stopping now would mean never being able to continue. In my house, everything important stayed unspoken. If someone was hurt, they acted normal. If someone was angry, they buried it. If something broke, no one named it. His words were calm, but not easy. They came out like pieces of something old and rusted, loosened only by pressure. Claire watched him carefully. She had imagined many explanations for his distance. Fear, indifference, even selfishness. But this sounded different. Not like excuse. More like inheritance. Daniel let out a breath and rubbed his palms together. My father thought emotions made people weak, he said, and my mother, she was there. But not really. She kept the house running. She made dinner. She smiled when she needed to. But I can't remember a single time she sat down and asked me what I was feeling. Claire felt something in her chest tighten, not because his words erased her pain, but because they placed it inside a pattern older than both of them. Daniel had not learned distance by accident. He had been raised inside it. As a kid, he continued, you learn pretty fast what gets you attention and what gets you ignored. And where I came from, the safest thing was to need nothing. That sentence stayed between them. The safest thing was to need nothing. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it settle, because suddenly so much of Daniel made sense. The way he went quiet when emotions deepened. The way he offered care in practical ways but recoiled from vulnerability. The way he could stay physically close while remaining emotionally unreachable. This was not a man who had chosen coldness because he enjoyed it. This was a man who had mistaken emotional absence for survival. Daniel finally looked at her then. And for the first time that night, his face held something unguarded. When you asked for more from me, he said softly, I didn't always pull away because I didn't care. Sometimes I pulled away because I honestly didn't know what to do. Claire said nothing. Not because she had no response, but because she understood that this moment did not belong to comfort. It belonged to truth. Daniel's eyes drifted away again. I never told you any of this, he said, because saying it out loud makes it real. And if it's real, then I have to admit how much of my life I've spent hiding inside it. The room felt smaller somehow. Not with closeness, but with exposure. Claire could feel the ache of two realities existing at once. His wound was real. And so was the damage it had done. That was the hardest part. Compassion did not erase consequence. Understanding did not undo loneliness. And yet, hearing him finally name the shape of his silence changed something in her. Not enough to heal what had already been broken, but enough to remove the last illusion that love alone could translate a language he had never been taught to speak. Because the truth Daniel had never said before was not simply that he struggled with feelings. It was that somewhere deep inside, he had built a life around one invisible belief. If I do not need, then I cannot be hurt. And Claire realized, with a sadness deeper than anger, that loving someone like that often means standing at the edge of their heart, while they spend years learning how to walk back toward it themselves. 11. Understanding doesn't heal the hurt. For a moment after Daniel finished speaking, the room felt strangely quiet. Not the kind of silence that follows an argument. Not the tense stillness of people waiting to defend themselves. This silence was heavier than that. It was the kind that arrives when two people finally understand each other, but realize that understanding alone may not be enough. Claire sat across from him, her hands resting loosely in her lap. She had listened to everything he said, about his childhood, about the house where feelings were never spoken, about the years he spent learning that needing nothing was the safest way to live. And she believed him. That was the hardest part. She believed every word. For months, Claire had wondered if Daniel's distance meant indifference. She had questioned herself over and over again, replaying conversations in her mind late at night, trying to figure out whether she had asked for too much, felt too deeply, expected something unrealistic. Now she knew the truth. Daniel wasn't indifferent. He was unequipped. But knowing that did not erase the ache she had carried through every unanswered message. Every unfinished conversation. Every night she lay awake wondering why love between them felt like something she had to reach for alone. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of that realization settle. Empathy had arrived. Relief had not. Because there is a quiet misunderstanding people often have about love, the belief that once you understand someone's pain, everything else will suddenly make sense. But understanding is not the same as healing. And compassion is not the same as fulfillment. Claire could see the shape of Daniel's past now. She could imagine the boy he had once been, growing up in rooms where emotions were treated like weaknesses. She could understand how someone raised in that kind of silence might grow into a man who struggled to stay present when feelings grew too deep. But empathy did not rebuild the moments she had spent feeling alone beside him. It did not return the nights she had waited for warmth that never came. And it did not change the simple truth standing quietly between them now. Daniel still didn't know how to love her the way she needed. Claire looked back up at him. His face carried something fragile now, something almost like regret. Not dramatic regret, not the kind that begs for forgiveness. Just the quiet recognition that he had finally explained himself, and that explanation had come too late to change what had already been lost. "I'm glad you told me," Claire said softly. And she meant it. Because truth, even when painful, has a way of clearing the fog that keeps people trapped inside their own doubts. For so long, Claire had wondered if she had imagined the distance between them. Now she knew she hadn't. Daniel nodded slowly, as if he understood that her words were sincere, but incomplete. Because what neither of them said out loud was the part that mattered most. Understanding had finally arrived. But the hurt was still there. And sometimes, when love has been asking for oxygen for too long, clarity comes not as a rescue, but as the quiet moment you realize the air was never going to return. 12. The realization that changed her. Claire did not arrive at that realization all at once. It did not come like lightning. It did not crash through her like some dramatic revelation. It came quietly. The way certain truths do when they have been waiting patiently beneath your pain. Becoming clearer each time you stop defending what keeps hurting you. For a long time, Claire had measured love by endurance. By how much confusion she could survive. By how long she could stay gentle while being slowly starved of what she needed. By how often she could translate distance into something softer, something kinder, something less painful than it really was. She had mistaken patience for devotion. She had mistaken emotional hunger for depth. And most dangerously of all, she had mistaken waiting for love. That night, after Daniel left, Claire sat alone in her apartment with no music on, no television, no distractions to soften the silence. The room felt almost unfamiliar in its stillness. The lamp in the corner cast a low amber light across the floor. And the city outside moved on without asking anything of her. For the first time in months, Claire did not reach for her phone. She did not replay his words again and again, searching for some hidden version of hope inside them. She did not try to reinterpret his distance as fear, or his withdrawal as temporary confusion, or his inability as unfinished potential. She was too tired to lie to herself anymore. And that exhaustion gave birth to something unexpected. Clarity. Not the kind that feels triumphant. Not the kind that makes you feel instantly strong. The quieter kind. The kind that hurts because it asks you to stop romanticizing what has already shown you its limits. Claire leaned back into the couch and let the truth settle fully this time. Daniel's wound was real. His past was real. His emotional limitations were real. But so was her loneliness. So was the ache of never feeling chosen in the moments that mattered most. So was the grief of reaching for someone who kept offering presents in pieces, but never in full. And suddenly, Claire saw the shape of her own pattern just as clearly as she had seen his. She had spent so much time trying to understand why Daniel could not love more openly, that she had stopped asking why she had accepted so little for so long. That question changed everything. Because it moved the story away from him. Away from his childhood. Away from his fear. Away from the endless temptation to rescue, explain, and endure. And it brought her back to herself. Back to the woman who had been making excuses for absence. Back to the woman who had been shrinking her needs until they sounded easier to carry. Back to the woman who kept calling it love even when it felt more like emotional rationing. Claire closed her eyes and breathed in slowly. For the first time, she understood that love was not supposed to feel like a constant act of interpretation. It was not supposed to leave her guessing. Not supposed to leave her proving. Not supposed to leave her grateful for fragments. Love could be quiet, yes. But it still had to be available. It still had to stay. And in that moment, Claire realized something that did not just break her heart, it rebuilt her identity. She was not heartbroken because she had asked for too much. She was heartbroken because she had spent too long betraying what she truly needed in order to keep someone who could only meet her halfway. That was the realization that changed her. Not that Daniel was wounded, but that she could not keep living inside someone else's limitations and calling it loyalty. Because there comes a point in every painful love story when the question is no longer, why can't they love me the way I need? It becomes, why have I been asking so little of love and so little for myself? And once Claire truly saw that, she knew something inside her had already begun to leave, long before her body ever would. 13. The sentence that freed her. For a long time, Claire had believed that the most important moment in love would be the one where everything finally made sense. The moment when confusion would dissolve. When two people would look at each other and say the exact words that brought clarity. But when that moment arrived, it didn't feel triumphant. It felt quiet. Daniel was still sitting across from her, his shoulders slightly curved forward, his hands loosely clasped together as if he had already run out of ways to hold the conversation in place. The room was dim, the same soft lamp lighting the edges of the furniture. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the streetlights reflected against the wet pavement like faint mirrors. Claire watched him carefully. Not with hope anymore. Not with the desperate patience she had carried for months. Just with attention. The kind of attention that appears when someone finally stops fighting reality. Daniel looked up at her, then away again. There was something unsettled in his expression, something like hesitation mixed with relief. And then he said the sentence that changed everything. "I wish I could be the man you deserve." The words fell softly between them. Not dramatic. Not cruel. In fact, they were almost kind. For a moment, Claire felt the familiar reflex rise inside her, the instinct to soften his words. To translate them into something less final. Maybe he meant he would try. Maybe he meant he needed time. Maybe he meant this was only temporary. But the clarity she had found earlier did something different this time. It stopped her from rewriting the truth. Because when she listened carefully, the sentence was not a promise. It was a goodbye disguised as humility. Daniel wasn't saying he would grow. He wasn't asking her to stay. He was acknowledging the distance between who he was and what she needed, and quietly stepping out of the space between them. Claire let the words sit in the room without rescuing them. Without rescuing him. She noticed something surprising in herself. The sharp ache in her chest was still there, but beneath it was something steadier, something calmer. Freedom rarely feels like celebration at first. Sometimes it feels like silence after a long noise. Claire nodded slowly. "I know," she said. Daniel looked up again, surprised by how gently she had answered. There was no accusation in her voice. No bitterness. Just acceptance. For the first time since they had started this conversation, Claire wasn't trying to hold the relationship together with explanations or patience or emotional translation. She was simply standing in the truth of it. Daniel exhaled quietly. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said. Claire believed that too. But she had learned something important that night. Intentions do not change outcomes. And kindness does not replace presence. She stood up slowly from the couch and walked toward the window. The city outside had returned to its normal rhythm, cars passing through intersections. Distant conversations drifting upward from the sidewalk. Life had not stopped for this moment. And suddenly Claire realized something else. She had spent so long hoping Daniel would choose her fully, that she had forgotten she could choose herself. The sentence he spoke had not trapped her. It had released her. Because when someone finally admits they cannot meet you where you are, the choice becomes clear in a way that confusion never allowed. Claire turned back toward him. There was sadness in her eyes, but there was also something new. Not anger. Not resignation. Something stronger. Peace. And in that quiet room, she understood that sometimes the sentence that breaks your heart is also the one that finally gives it back to you. 14. Learning to leave quietly. The strange thing about endings is that they rarely arrive all at once. Most of the time, they unfold quietly. Not in dramatic arguments. Not in sudden explosions of emotion. But in small decisions made inside a heart that has finally stopped negotiating with reality. After that night, Claire did not storm out of Daniel's life. She didn't send a long message explaining everything he had done wrong. She didn't demand closure or try to force a final emotional conversation that might somehow rewrite the story. Instead, she did something much quieter. She stepped back. At first, even that felt unfamiliar. For months, Claire had been the one reaching out, asking questions, opening conversations that Daniel never quite knew how to continue, holding emotional space that often felt larger than what two people were actually sharing. Now, for the first time, she let the silence remain exactly as it was. When Daniel sent a short message the next afternoon, "Hope your day's going okay," Claire read it calmly. She didn't search for hidden meaning. She didn't imagine it was the beginning of a different version of him. She simply replied, "Thank you, I hope yours is too." No extra question. No emotional invitation. Just kindness without attachment. And something inside her felt strangely steady. Because leaving quietly is not the same as disappearing. It is the decision to stop chasing what refuses to move toward you. Over the next few days, Claire noticed the shift in herself more clearly. She slept earlier. Her thoughts were quieter. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't replaying conversations in her mind late at night, trying to decode every pause and every unfinished sentence Daniel had ever spoken. There was nothing left to decode. The story had already explained itself. One evening, she walked through the park near her apartment just as the sky was turning the pale gold of early sunset. Families were packing up picnics. Dogs pulled gently at their leashes. A child's laughter carried across the grass. Life looked simple there. Not perfect. Just whole. Claire sat on a bench and watched the light move slowly across the trees. For so long, she had believed that leaving meant failure. That walking away from someone you loved meant giving up too easily. Or not trying hard enough to make things work. But now she understood something different. Sometimes staying requires you to abandon yourself. And sometimes leaving is the first honest thing love asks you to do. Claire wasn't angry with Daniel. She could see his wounds clearly now. She could even imagine how long it might take him to learn the language of emotional presence he had never been taught. But that journey belonged to him. Not to her. She had spent too much time standing beside a door that only opened halfway. Now she was learning what it meant to walk through her own. And that was the quiet power of leaving. Not revenge. Not bitterness. Just the calm recognition that love should never require you to disappear in order to keep it alive. Claire stood up from the bench and began walking home as the evening light softened around the city. There was sadness in her chest. But there was also something new. Space. The kind of space that appears when you stop holding on to something that was never truly holding you back. And step by step, without anger and without drama, Claire was learning something that many people never fully understand. Sometimes the strongest way to love yourself is simply to leave quietly. 15. What he realized too late. At first, Daniel told himself nothing had really changed. Claire had not left with anger. She had not demanded answers. She had not said the kinds of sharp, unforgettable things people usually say when love finally breaks. She had simply grown quiet. And because the ending had been so calm, Daniel made the mistake many emotionally distant people make. He assumed that quiet meant manageable. He assumed that absence would feel temporary. He assumed that because Claire had always been there before, some part of her would still remain waiting in the background. But silence feels very different when it no longer belongs to avoidance. Now it belonged to loss. The first few days after their conversation passed in a blur of work, errands, and routine. Daniel woke up, checked emails, sat through meetings, answered questions, made decisions. On the surface, everything still moved with the same efficiency it always had. But something underneath had changed its shape. He noticed it in the smallest moments. When he reached for his phone during lunch and realized there was no message from Claire asking how his day was going. When he came home late and there was no quiet sense that someone, somewhere, still cared whether he had eaten. When something mildly funny happened at work and, for half a second, his mind turned toward her before remembering there was no longer a place to send it. That was how absence entered him. Not all at once, but in ordinary fragments. A missing text. A silence at the end of the day. A life that still functioned but no longer felt witnessed. One Thursday evening, Daniel returned to his apartment after a long day and stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, loosening his tie with one hand while the other rested on the counter. The room was dim. The city outside glowed through the windows in cold lines of light. Usually, he would turn on the television just to fill the space. This time, he didn't. He let the quiet stay. And in that quiet, something uncomfortable began to surface. Claire had not just loved him. She had carried him emotionally in ways he had never fully measured. She had been the one asking the second question when he stopped at the first. The one noticing his moods even when he could barely name them himself. The one offering warmth without demanding perfection. The one creating softness around him that he had quietly come to depend on without ever admitting it. Daniel sank into the couch and stared at the dark screen across the room. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel what Claire had probably felt for months. The loneliness of being with someone who is physically present in the world, but emotionally absent from the place that matters most. Except now Claire was truly gone from the emotional space between them. And Daniel was the one sitting inside the emptiness. He thought back to all the moments he had dismissed because they seemed small. The times she had asked for honesty and he gave her caution. The times she had reached for closeness and he offered politeness. The times he sensed her pain but convinced himself it could wait until later. Later. That word suddenly felt cruel. Because later had always been where he placed the things that asked too much of his heart. And now later had arrived without her. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and pressed his palms together as if holding himself in place. A sharp regret moved through him, not dramatic, not cinematic, but heavy and exact. He had not lost Claire in one conversation. He had lost her slowly. Every time he failed to meet her where she stood. Every time he let discomfort become distance. Every time he chose emotional safety over emotional truth. Every time he assumed care could survive without presence. That was what he realized too late. Claire had never been asking for perfection. She had been asking for participation. For honesty. For emotional availability. For the simple courage of staying present when love became real. And by the time Daniel understood that, the version of Claire who would have kept waiting was already gone. The painful thing about regret is that it does not always come with a chance to repair. Sometimes it arrives only to make you fully feel the weight of what your silence cost. Daniel sat there long after the room had gone dark, with the city lights flickering against the glass and the truth settling deeper into him with every passing minute. He had spent so much of his life believing that withholding protected him. But all it had really done was teach him how to lose something gentle before he understood its worth. 16. The kind of love she will never accept again. Months later, Claire realized something surprising. The story that once felt like the center of her world had slowly moved into the background of her life. Not erased. Not forgotten. But no longer defining who she was. Healing had not arrived as a sudden breakthrough. It came quietly, through ordinary days. Through mornings where she woke up without replaying the past in her mind. Through conversations with friends that felt light again. Through long walks where her thoughts were no longer circling the same questions that once kept her awake at night. At first, Claire wondered if moving on meant she had somehow minimized what she once felt. But the truth was the opposite. She had not loved Daniel less. She had simply learned more about what love must never ask her to tolerate again. There are certain experiences that change the way you recognize emotional reality. Once you have felt the loneliness of loving someone who cannot truly meet you where you are, you begin to see the difference between affection and presence. Between attention and availability. Between someone who enjoys being loved, and someone who knows how to love in return. Claire didn't become bitter after the relationship ended. If anything, she became clearer. Clear about the kind of love she would never accept again. Not the love that stays emotionally distant while asking you to be patient. Not the love that appears warm in moments of comfort but disappears when emotional honesty is required. Not the love that quietly teaches you to shrink your needs just to keep the connection alive. Because real love does not grow in emotional absence. It grows in presence. In participation. In two people choosing, again and again, to stay open even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the city skyline, Claire sat near the window of a small cafe she had started visiting regularly. The room was filled with the soft sounds of quiet conversations and the gentle rhythm of coffee cups being placed on wooden tables. Life around her felt simple again. Not perfect. But grounded. Claire looked out at the street for a moment and noticed something that once would have frightened her. She no longer needed Daniel to explain the past. She no longer needed closure in the form of words he might never say. The clarity she had been searching for had come from somewhere else. from within. And that clarity had given her something stronger than answers. It had given her standards. The kind that protect your heart without closing it. The kind that allow love to enter your life again, but only in its honest form. Claire smiled softly to herself. Because now she understood something she had never fully known before. The goal of healing is not to become someone who never loves again. It is to become someone who never abandons themselves while loving. And somewhere out there, she knew, there were people learning the same lesson she once had to learn the hard way. If this story feels familiar to you, if you've ever loved someone who could not meet you emotionally, or if you've ever had to walk away from something your heart once wanted to save, then you're not alone. Stories like this exist because so many people are quietly learning the same truth. Love should never require you to disappear. If this conversation touched something real inside you, consider sharing this video with someone who might need to hear it too. Leave a comment and tell us the moment you realized your worth in love. And if you believe that emotional clarity, healing, and honest conversations about relationships matter, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast for more stories like this. Because sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that help us understand ourselves the most.